In the shadowed corridors of history, where the whispers of forgotten rulers still echo against cold stone walls, lies a truth so fundamental and unforgiving that most dare not speak its name. It is the truth that Niccolò Machiavelli dared to illuminate in his scandalous treatise, though he clothed it in the language of political necessity. This truth concerns not merely the acquisition of power, but something far more intimate and terrifying, the relentless power that dwells within each of us, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be wielded, yet perpetually avoided by those too timid to face their own potential for dominion. The year was 1513 when Machiavelli, exiled from Florence and stripped of his political influence, sat in his modest estate and penned what would become one of history's most controversial works. Yet beyond the political machinations he described lay a deeper revelation, one that extends far beyond the realm of princes and politics into the very heart of human existence. For Machiavelli understood that power is not merely something possessed by rulers and generals, it is the fundamental currency of all human interaction, the invisible force that shapes every relationship, every decision, every moment of our lives. Consider the merchant who rises before dawn, not because he must, but because he understands that in those quiet hours before the world awakens, he can shape the day's outcomes. Consider the mother who speaks with quiet authority to her children, knowing that her words will echo in their minds for decades. Consider the teacher who chooses which ideas to plant in young minds, understanding that knowledge itself is the ultimate weapon. Each of these individuals wields power, yet how many would admit to seeking it? How many would confess to the intoxicating thrill that comes from influencing another's fate? This is the great deception we practice upon ourselves, the belief that power is something external, something belonging to others, something we neither possess nor desire. We speak of power as if it were a foreign substance, dangerous and corrupting, while simultaneously exercising it in countless subtle ways throughout our daily existence. The businessman who negotiates a contract exercises power. The friend who offers advice exercises power. The writer who crafts these very words exercises power over the mind of the reader. Yet we shrink from acknowledging this reality because to do so would be to admit something uncomfortable about our own nature. Machiavelli recognized this fundamental hypocrisy when he observed that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that he who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. But the greatest deception is often the one we practice upon ourselves. We deceive ourselves into believing that we are powerless, that we are merely victims of circumstance, that the forces shaping our lives are beyond our control. This self-deception serves a psychological function. It absolves us of responsibility, it protects us from the burden of choice, and it shields us from the terrifying awareness of our own potential for both creation and destruction. Yet Machiavelli understood something profound about human nature that modern society has largely forgotten. He understood that the denial of power does not eliminate it, it merely drives it underground, where it festers and manifests in twisted, destructive forms. The person who refuses to acknowledge their desire for influence may become manipulative rather than direct. The individual who denies their need for control may become passive-aggressive rather than assertive. The one who rejects their natural authority may find themselves perpetually frustrated, unable to understand why their life lacks direction and purpose. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli witnessed firsthand the consequences of both embracing and avoiding power. He saw rulers who acknowledged their nature as wielders of force and used it judiciously to create stability and prosperity. He also saw those who attempted to rule through kindness alone, only to watch their kingdoms crumble into chaos and their subjects suffer under the weight of indecision and weakness. From these observations, he developed his famous maxim that it is better to be feared than loved, though this statement has been grossly misunderstood by centuries of scholars and critics. The misunderstanding lies in the assumption that fear and love are mutually exclusive, and that Machiavelli advocated for tyranny over benevolence. In reality, he was describing a fundamental truth about human psychology: respect and admiration flow naturally toward those who demonstrate competence and strength, while pity and eventual contempt are the lot of those who reveal themselves to be weak and indecisive. The parent who sets clear boundaries is more loved by their children than the one who permits chaos. The leader who makes difficult decisions is more respected than the one who avoids all conflict. The individual who stands firmly for their principles is more admired than the one who bends with every wind of opinion. This brings us to the first part of our exploration, the recognition that power avoidance is itself a form of power, a negative power that shapes reality through inaction rather than action. When we refuse to acknowledge our capacity for influence, we do not become powerless, we become unconsciously powerful, wielding our influence in ways we neither recognize nor control. The employee who passively resists their supervisor's directions exercises power through non-compliance. The friend who withdraws emotional support exercises power through absence. The citizen who refuses to vote exercises power through abdication. Every moment of every day, we are faced with choices that represent exercises of power. The words we choose to speak or withhold, the attention we decide to give or refuse, the emotions we express or suppress, all of these represent deployments of our personal force in the world. Yet most people move through life unconscious of these choices, responding automatically to stimuli rather than deliberately shaping outcomes. They become, in Machiavellian terms, the subject of others' will rather than the authors of their own destiny. The businessman who built his empire from nothing understood this principle intuitively. In the early days of his enterprise, when creditors threatened foreclosure and competitors circled like vultures, he made a conscious choice that would define his entire future. Rather than pleading for mercy or hoping for salvation from external sources, he decided to embrace the full weight of his situation. He called together his creditors not to beg for extensions, but to present them with a detailed plan for not merely surviving the crisis, but emerging from it stronger than before. In that conference room, facing men who held his financial future in their hands, he discovered something profound about the nature of power. He realized that confidence, backed by competence and clear vision, could transform apparent weakness into actual strength. By taking full responsibility for his situation rather than making excuses, by presenting solutions rather than problems, by demonstrating leadership in the face of adversity, he shifted the entire dynamic of the relationship. The creditors, who had entered the room as his superiors, left as his partners. They had witnessed the alchemy by which powerlessness transforms into power through the simple act of acknowledgement and acceptance. This transformation did not occur through manipulation or deception, but through the recognition of a fundamental truth: power flows naturally toward those who are willing to bear responsibility. In a world full of people seeking to avoid accountability, those who embrace it stand out like towers of strength in a landscape of shifting sand. They become magnets for the respect, cooperation, and resources of others, not because they demand these things, but because they demonstrate through their actions that they can be trusted to use them wisely. Yet this businessman's story reveals another crucial aspect of power that Machiavelli understood but that most modern individuals refuse to accept: the exercise of power always involves risk. There is no guarantee that confidence will be rewarded, that responsibility will be recognized, that leadership will be followed. The businessman could have failed spectacularly. His creditors could have rejected his proposals and proceeded with foreclosure. His confidence could have been interpreted as arrogance, his vision dismissed as delusion. This uncertainty is precisely why most people avoid fully embracing their power. They seek guarantees that do not exist, assurances that cannot be given. They want to wield influence without accepting the possibility of failure, to exercise authority without bearing the weight of consequences. But power without risk is not power at all, it is merely the illusion of control, and illusions inevitably shatter when confronted with reality. The teacher who transformed an entire school district understood this principle in a different context. When she arrived at the struggling institution, test scores were abysmal, morale was non-existent, and the community had largely given up hope. The previous administrators had attempted to address these problems through external solutions, new curricula, additional funding, policy changes imposed from above. All of these efforts had failed because they did not address the fundamental issue: the absence of someone willing to accept complete responsibility for the institution's success or failure. This teacher made a choice that would have seemed impossible to her colleagues. She decided to treat every student's failure as her own failure, every behavioral problem as a reflection of her own inadequacy, every missed opportunity as evidence of her own lack of vision. This was not self-flagellation or misguided martyrdom, it was a strategic decision to claim complete ownership of her sphere of influence. By refusing to blame external factors, poverty, family dysfunction, administrative incompetence, societal problems, she transformed herself from a victim of circumstances into an agent of change. The results were initially subtle but ultimately revolutionary. When students misbehaved, she did not send them to the principal's office, she examined her own teaching methods to determine how she might better engage their attention. When test scores lagged, she did not blame the curriculum, she sought new ways to help students understand the material. When parents failed to support their children's education, she did not write them off, she found ways to demonstrate the value of academic achievement through her own example. Over time, something remarkable occurred. The students began to respond to this level of personal investment with increased effort of their own. Parents started attending school functions they had previously ignored. Other teachers began adopting similar approaches in their own classrooms. The entire culture of the institution shifted because one individual had been willing to fully embrace her power, not the formal authority granted by her position, but the informal influence that comes from total commitment and unwavering responsibility. This teacher's transformation of her school district illustrates another crucial aspect of power that Machiavelli recognized: true power multiplies itself. When genuinely exercised, it does not diminish the power of others but rather awakens and develops their own capacity for influence. The tyrant who rules through fear alone creates a zero-sum game where his strength requires others' weakness. But the leader who rules through competence and vision creates a positive-sum environment where everyone's power increases. This principle explains why some individuals seem to effortlessly attract followers while others struggle to maintain control despite their official authority. The difference lies not in charisma or manipulation, but in the fundamental approach to power itself. Those who view power as a finite resource to be hoarded inevitably create resistance and resentment. Those who view power as an infinite capacity to be developed and shared create loyalty and enthusiasm. The mother who raised 5 children to become successful leaders in their respective fields understood this principle instinctively. She never sought to control her children through force or manipulation, yet her influence over their development was profound and lasting. Her power lay not in her ability to command obedience, but in her willingness to accept complete responsibility for creating an environment where each child could discover and develop their own unique strengths. When her eldest son struggled with mathematics, she did not simply hire a tutor or accept that he was not a math person. Instead, she examined her own understanding of how learning occurs and developed new methods for helping him grasp numerical concepts. When her daughter showed signs of rebellious behavior, she did not impose stricter rules but rather looked for ways to channel that rebellious energy into constructive directions. When her youngest child displayed artistic talents that seemed impractical for earning a living, she did not discourage these interests but instead sought ways to help him develop both his creative abilities and practical skills. In each case, she exercised power not by controlling her children's choices, but by expanding the range of positive choices available to them. She shaped their environment, modeled appropriate behavior, provided guidance when requested, and maintained unwavering standards of excellence. Yet she never attempted to live their lives for them or to spare them from the consequences of their own decisions. This approach required tremendous courage because it meant accepting responsibility for outcomes she could not fully control. Each child's success or failure reflected not only their own efforts but also her effectiveness as a parent. She could not blame genetics, circumstances, or the children themselves if her methods proved inadequate. She had claimed full ownership of her role in their development, which meant bearing the full weight of both success and failure. The results of this approach became evident as the children matured. Rather than rebelling against her influence, they sought her counsel throughout their lives. Rather than feeling constrained by her expectations, they felt empowered to exceed them. Rather than viewing her as an obstacle to their independence, they recognized her as the foundation upon which their autonomy was built. Her power over them actually increased as they became adults because it had always been exercised in service of their own empowerment rather than her own ego. Part 2, The Architecture of Influence. The second dimension of the power we avoid facing concerns the systematic nature of influence itself. Machiavelli understood that power is not merely a momentary exertion of will, but rather an architectural achievement, a carefully constructed edifice of relationships, systems, and capabilities that endures beyond any single decision or action. Just as a master architect designs buildings that will stand for centuries, the master of personal power creates structures of influence that compound and magnify their effect over time. Most people think of power in terms of immediate, visible actions: the general commanding troops, the executive making decisions, the politician delivering speeches. But these dramatic moments are merely the visible peaks of vast subterranean systems of preparation, relationship building, skill development, and strategic thinking. The true exercise of power occurs in the thousands of small, seemingly insignificant choices that shape the foundation upon which great achievements are built. Consider the story of the woman who transformed herself from a timid office worker into one of the most influential consultants in her industry. Her transformation did not occur through a single moment of revelation or dramatic career change. Instead, it unfolded through a systematic program of power development that spanned nearly a decade. When she first recognized her own power avoidance, she was working as a mid-level administrator in a large corporation, intelligent and capable but virtually invisible to senior management. Her awakening came through a painful realization: despite her competence and dedication, she was being consistently overlooked for promotions and meaningful assignments. Her initial response was to blame external factors: gender discrimination, office politics, favoritism. But, after months of frustration and self-pity, she began to examine her own role in her professional stagnation. She realized that she had been unconsciously positioning herself as someone to be protected rather than someone to be empowered. This recognition led to the first principle of her systematic approach to power development: the cultivation of what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but competence, capability, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. She began a rigorous program of skill development that went far beyond the technical requirements of her position. She studied finance to understand the business implications of her administrative decisions. She learned presentation skills to communicate her ideas more effectively. She developed project management capabilities to demonstrate her ability to deliver results. But technical skills alone were insufficient. Machiavelli understood that power in human organizations is fundamentally social, requiring the ability to understand and influence the motivations of others. The woman began to study the informal power structures within her organization, mapping the relationships and influence patterns that determined how decisions were actually made. She identified the key influencers in her company, not just those with formal titles, but those whose opinions carried weight in crucial conversations. Rather than attempting to ingratiate herself with these individuals through flattery or manipulation, she focused on becoming genuinely useful to them. She volunteered for assignments that would bring her into contact with important projects. She developed expertise in areas where the organization had gaps. She made herself indispensable by consistently delivering value that others could not provide. Over time, senior executives began to seek her input not because she demanded attention, but because her contributions had proven to be consistently valuable. This process required her to overcome one of the most significant barriers to power development: the fear of visibility. Many people avoid exercising their full capabilities because they fear criticism, failure, or the burden of increased expectations. They prefer the safety of anonymity to the risks of prominence. But power and invisibility are fundamentally incompatible. To exercise influence, one must be willing to be seen, evaluated, and held accountable. The woman's strategy for overcoming this barrier was to gradually increase her visibility while simultaneously building her competence. She began by taking on small, low-risk projects where success was likely and failure would not be catastrophic. As she demonstrated her ability to deliver results, she accepted increasingly challenging assignments that brought greater visibility and responsibility. Each success built her reputation and created opportunities for larger successes. Within 3 years, she had been promoted twice and was being consulted on major strategic decisions. Within 5 years, she had been recruited by a prestigious consulting firm specifically because of her reputation for delivering results. Within 8 years, she had established her own consulting practice and was earning more than she had ever imagined possible. But the most significant transformation was not financial, it was psychological. She had evolved from someone who avoided responsibility to someone who actively sought it, from someone who feared failure to someone who viewed setbacks as learning opportunities, from someone who hoped for recognition to someone who commanded respect. Her story illustrates the second principle of systematic power development: the importance of creating what military strategists call force multipliers, investments that increase the impact of future efforts. Every skill she developed, every relationship she built, every success she achieved became a platform for greater achievements. Her early investments in financial literacy enabled her to speak intelligently with executives about business strategy. Her presentation skills allowed her to communicate complex ideas with clarity and confidence. Her project management experience demonstrated her ability to coordinate resources and deliver results. More importantly, her systematic approach to relationship building created a network of allies and supporters who became advocates for her advancement. These relationships were not based on manipulation or false friendship, but on genuine value creation. She had consistently helped others achieve their goals, which made them naturally inclined to help her achieve hers. When opportunities arose, these individuals thought of her not because she had lobbied for consideration, but because they had personally witnessed her capabilities. This networking principle reflects another crucial insight from Machiavellian thinking: sustainable power must be based on mutual benefit rather than unilateral extraction. The prince who enriches himself while impoverishing his subjects creates the conditions for rebellion. The leader who advances her career while undermining her colleagues creates enemies who will eventually work against her. But the individual who creates value for others while pursuing her own goals builds a foundation of support that grows stronger over time. The businessman mentioned earlier applied this same principle when building his empire. Rather than viewing his relationships with suppliers, customers, employees, and competitors as zero-sum games where his gain required their loss, he consciously designed business models that created value for all stakeholders. He paid suppliers promptly and fairly, which earned him priority treatment during shortages. He delivered exceptional value to customers, which generated referrals and repeat business. He invested in employee development, which created loyalty and reduced turnover. He even found ways to collaborate with competitors on projects that benefited the entire industry. This approach required him to think systematically about the long-term implications of his decisions rather than focusing solely on immediate gains. When faced with the opportunity to exploit a supplier's financial difficulties by demanding steep discounts, he instead offered extended payment terms that helped the supplier survive a difficult period. This short-term cost became a long-term asset when the supplier, having recovered, gave him access to new products and markets that would not have been available to a customer who had taken advantage of their vulnerability. Similarly, when a key employee received a competing job offer, he resisted the temptation to simply match the salary and instead invested time in understanding the employee's long-term career aspirations. He restructured the position to provide greater growth opportunities and created a development plan that addressed the employee's professional goals. The employee not only stayed but became one of his most effective recruiters, bringing in talented colleagues who were attracted by the company's reputation for investing in its people. These examples illustrate the third principle of systematic power development: the compounding effect of consistent behavior over time. Just as financial investments grow through compound interest, investments in competence, relationships, and reputation create exponential returns when sustained over extended periods. The woman who became a successful consultant did not achieve her transformation through any single brilliant strategy or fortunate break. Instead, she made hundreds of small, consistent choices that aligned with her long-term goals. Each day, she chose to learn rather than coast, to contribute rather than merely comply, to take responsibility rather than avoid accountability. This consistency principle is perhaps the most difficult aspect of power development because it requires sustained effort without guaranteed results. Many people begin personal transformation projects with great enthusiasm but abandon them when they fail to see immediate progress. They expect linear growth and become discouraged when their efforts produce periods of apparent stagnation followed by sudden breakthroughs. But power development, like muscle development, occurs through cycles of stress and recovery that can be invisible to external observation. The teacher who transformed her school district experienced this phenomenon repeatedly. During her first year, despite enormous effort and innovative approaches, test scores actually declined. Critics began to question her methods, and she faced pressure from administrators to return to conventional approaches. But she understood that transformation often requires temporary disruption before lasting improvement occurs. Students who had become accustomed to low expectations needed time to adjust to new standards. Teaching methods that had been acceptable needed to be unlearned before better methods could be implemented. The entire culture of the institution had to be destabilized before it could be rebuilt on a stronger foundation. Her persistence during this difficult period was not based on blind faith but on systematic feedback collection and analysis. She continuously monitored leading indicators: student engagement, attendance patterns, parental involvement, teacher collaboration that would predict future outcomes even when test scores had not yet improved. She also studied examples of other successful school transformations to understand the typical timeline and challenges involved in such efforts.
This research helped her maintain confidence in her approach even when immediate results were disappointing.
The fourth principle of systematic power development is the creation of feedback loops that enable continuous improvement and adaptation. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of understanding the true effects of one's actions rather than simply assuming success based on good intentions. He observed many rulers who believed their policies were working because no one dared to tell them the truth about their failures. The wise prince, he argued, actively seeks accurate information about the results of his decisions and adjusts his approach based on evidence rather than wishful thinking.
Modern individuals often make the same mistake in their personal power development. They assume that hard work automatically leads to success, that good intentions guarantee good outcomes, that effort is equivalent to effectiveness.
But sustainable power requires the ability to distinguish between activity and achievement, between motion and progress, between being busy and being productive. The successful consultant develops sophisticated methods for gathering honest feedback about her performance and impact. She regularly surveyed clients not just about their satisfaction but about specific ways her work had influenced their decisions and outcomes. She asked colleagues for candid assessments of her presentations and proposals. She tracked which types of projects produced the best results and which clients were most likely to provide referrals. This information enabled her to continuously refine her approach and focus her efforts on the activities that produced the greatest return on investment. More importantly, she created systems for learning from failures and setbacks rather than simply trying to avoid them. When a project did not meet expectations, she conducted detailed postmortems to understand what had gone wrong and how similar problems could be prevented in the future. When a client relationship ended unsatisfactorily, she examined her own role in the difficulties rather than simply blaming the client's unreasonable expectations. When a proposal was rejected, she sought feedback about how it could have been more compelling. This commitment to learning from failure reflects the fifth principle of systematic power development, the cultivation of what psychologists call growth mindset, the belief that abilities can be developed through effort and learning rather than being fixed traits that some people possess and others lack. Individuals with fixed mindsets tend to avoid challenges that might reveal their limitations, to give up quickly when faced with obstacles, and to view criticism as personal attacks rather than opportunities for improvement. Those with growth mindsets seek out challenges that will stretch their capabilities, persist through difficulties because they view them as temporary, and welcome feedback as information that can help them improve.
The mother who raised 5 successful children demonstrated this growth mindset in her approach to parenting. When her methods produced disappointing results, she did not conclude that she was a bad parent or that her children were flawed. Instead, she examined what she could learn from the situation and how she might adjust her approach. When her daughter's rebellious behavior persisted despite consistent consequences, she researched adolescent psychology and consulted with other experienced parents. When her son's academic struggles continued despite tutoring, she investigated learning differences and alternative teaching methods. When her youngest child's artistic interests seemed to conflict with practical career preparation, she sought examples of how creativity could be combined with financial success. In each case, she viewed challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than evidence of inevitable failure. This mindset enabled her to maintain optimism and persistence even during difficult periods when progress seemed impossible. More importantly, it modeled for her children the importance of continuous learning and adaptation rather than giving up when faced with obstacles. The architectural approach to power development requires one final element that Machiavelli understood but that many modern individuals overlook: the importance of timing and patience. Great achievements are rarely accomplished quickly, and attempts to accelerate the process often undermine the foundation upon which sustainable success must be built. The prince who attempts to conquer too rapidly may win battles but lose wars. The individual who seeks advancement too aggressively may achieve temporary gains but create long-term enemies. The businessman's empire was built over decades, not years. Each expansion was carefully timed to occur when the foundation was strong enough to support additional growth. Each new product line was introduced only after the previous ones had become profitable and stable. Each acquisition was pursued only when the company had the financial resources and management capacity to integrate it successfully. This patience was not passive waiting but active preparation, using periods of apparent stability to strengthen capabilities and resources for future opportunities.
Part 3, the courage of command. The third and most challenging dimension of the power we avoid facing concerns what Machiavelli called the effectual truth of leadership, the willingness to make difficult decisions and bear the full weight of their consequences. This is the aspect of power that most people find most frightening because it requires abandoning the comfortable illusion that someone else is ultimately responsible for the outcomes of our lives. It demands that we step forward and claim ownership not just of our own fate, but of our influence on the fate of others. The courage of command is different from physical bravery or moral virtue, though it may encompass both. It is the psychological courage to stand alone when necessary, to make decisions with incomplete information, to accept responsibility for results that cannot be fully controlled, and to maintain direction in the face of uncertainty and criticism. It is the courage to be wrong, to be blamed, to be misunderstood, and to continue leading despite these inevitable costs. This courage cannot be taught through instruction or inspiration alone, it must be developed through practice and proven through trial. Like physical strength, it grows through progressive resistance, becoming more powerful each time it is exercised under stress. And, like physical strength, it atrophies when not regularly used, leaving even experienced leaders vulnerable when they avoid difficult decisions for extended periods. Consider the story of the surgeon who revolutionized treatment protocols at a major metropolitan hospital. When she arrived as the new chief of surgery, the department was competent but not exceptional. Mortality rates were within acceptable ranges, complications occurred at predictable frequencies, and patient satisfaction scores met industry standards. But she recognized that acceptable performance in surgery meant that preventable deaths were being accepted as inevitable, that avoidable complications were being rationalized as unfortunate but expected, and that patients and families were being asked to tolerate outcomes that could be improved through better systems and procedures. Her analysis revealed that the hospital's surgical outcomes lagged behind the best institutions not because of inadequate skill or equipment, but because of systemic problems that no one was willing to address. Surgical schedules were designed for the convenience of surgeons rather than optimal patient outcomes. Communication protocols between surgical teams, anesthesiologists, and nursing staff were informal and inconsistent. Postoperative care procedures varied significantly between different surgeons, leading to confusion and occasional errors. Equipment maintenance and replacement followed bureaucratic timelines rather than clinical needs. Each of these problems was known to the staff, but addressing them would require challenging established practices, confronting senior colleagues, and potentially disrupting comfortable routines. Previous department heads had chosen to work within the existing system rather than forcing uncomfortable changes. They had maintained collegial relationships by avoiding conflict and had preserved their own reputations by accepting institutional limitations as immutable constraints. The new chief made a different choice. She decided that her primary obligation was to patient outcomes rather than colleague comfort, to excellence rather than harmony, to long-term improvement rather than short-term stability. This decision required her to exercise the first element of command courage, the willingness to disturb existing equilibrium in service of higher goals. Her initial actions were relatively modest but symbolically significant. She instituted mandatory pre-surgical briefings where all team members were required to verify patient information, discuss potential complications, and confirm their respective roles. She established standardized postoperative protocols that all surgeons would be expected to follow regardless of their personal preferences. She implemented systematic tracking of outcomes data that would be reviewed monthly and used to identify opportunities for improvement. These changes met with immediate resistance from surgeons who viewed them as unnecessary bureaucracy and from nurses who were already overwhelmed with existing responsibilities. Some colleagues accused her of implying that their previous practices were inadequate. Others suggested that she was more interested in advancing her own reputation than in genuine patient care. A few threatened to transfer to other hospitals where their autonomy would be respected. This resistance forced her to confront the second element of command courage, the ability to persist in the face of criticism and opposition. She could have modified her reforms to make them more palatable, or delayed implementation until she had built stronger consensus, or abandoned the most controversial changes altogether. Instead, she chose to address the resistance directly through education, explanation, and, when necessary, enforcement. She organized educational sessions where staff could learn about evidence-based practices that supported her reforms. She shared outcome data from hospitals that had implemented similar changes, demonstrating the measurable improvements in patient safety and satisfaction. She met individually with surgeons who had expressed concerns, listening to their objections and addressing legitimate practical issues while remaining firm about the fundamental principles underlying her reforms. When education and persuasion proved insufficient with a few individuals, she exercised disciplinary authority to ensure compliance. This required her to confront the third element of command courage, the willingness to enforce standards even when doing so creates personal animosity. A senior surgeon who repeatedly failed to follow the new protocols was given a formal warning and ultimately suspended from surgical privileges until he demonstrated compliance. A nursing supervisor who undermined the reforms by encouraging staff to ignore certain requirements was reassigned to a position where her resistance could not sabotage patient care.
These enforcement actions created temporary turmoil within the department.
Some staff members who had been neutral became concerned about the new chief's willingness to use her authority.
Others began to wonder whether they might be the next targets if their performance was deemed inadequate.
The hospital administration received complaints from influential physicians who threatened to take their practices elsewhere if the new policies were not modified. During this difficult period, the chief experienced the loneliness that is inherent in command positions.
She could not seek sympathy from her subordinates without undermining her authority.
She could not express doubts about her decisions without encouraging further resistance. She could not share the burden of responsibility with colleagues who had made clear their opposition to her leadership. She had to maintain confidence and direction while internally wrestling with uncertainty about whether her reforms would ultimately succeed. This loneliness represents the fourth element of command courage, the ability to bear psychological isolation in service of larger purposes. Leadership inevitably creates distance between the leader and those being led, not because leaders are inherently superior or aloof, but because the responsibilities of command require maintaining perspective and making decisions that may not be popular with those who are affected by them. The leader who seeks to be liked by everyone will inevitably compromise the standards and vision that justify their position. The surgeon's persistence through this difficult period was sustained by her commitment to what Machiavelli called the effectual truth, the actual results of actions rather than the stated intentions behind them. Despite the internal turmoil, patient outcomes began to improve within months of implementing her reforms.
Surgical complications decreased by 30%. Post-operative infections dropped significantly.
Patient satisfaction scores increased as communication improved and care became more consistent. Length of stay decreased as procedures became more efficient and recovery protocols more effective. These improvements provided objective validation of her approach and gradually shifted the internal dynamics of the department. Staff members who had initially resisted the changes began to take pride in the improved outcomes. Surgeons who had complained about bureaucratic interference began to appreciate how the standardized protocols actually made their work more efficient. Nurses who had been skeptical about additional responsibilities began to recognize how the improved systems reduced errors and stress. More importantly, the visible improvements attracted positive attention from hospital administration and medical colleagues at other institutions. The department began receiving referrals for complex cases because of its reputation for excellent outcomes. Talented surgeons and nurses sought positions in the department because they wanted to work in an environment committed to excellence. Medical students and residents competed for training opportunities in a program that was setting new standards for surgical care. This external recognition created a positive feedback loop that reinforced the internal cultural changes. Staff members who had initially viewed the reforms as burdensome impositions began to see them as sources of professional pride and competitive advantage. The department's reputation for excellence became a shared asset that everyone had an interest in protecting and enhancing. Resistance to further improvements decreased as staff members recognized the benefits of continuous advancement. The surgeon's success illustrates the fifth element of command courage, the ability to maintain long-term vision despite short-term setbacks and opposition. Many leaders abandon their initiatives when they encounter initial resistance, assuming that difficulty indicates error rather than recognizing that meaningful change inevitably creates temporary disruption. They seek the path of least resistance rather than the path of greatest effectiveness, choosing comfort over excellence and popularity over results.
But, the most significant aspect of the surgeon's transformation of her department was not the specific improvements she implemented. Other hospitals had adopted similar reforms with varying degrees of success. The crucial factor was her willingness to accept complete responsibility for the outcome of her leadership. She did not blame resistance on others' stubbornness or lack of vision. She did not attribute setbacks to institutional constraints or inadequate resources. She did not excuse failures by pointing to the difficulty of changing established cultures or the unreasonableness of expecting rapid improvement. Instead, she approached her leadership role as if the success or failure of her reforms depended entirely on her own competence, persistence, and strategic thinking. When resistance emerged, she examined her communication methods and developed more effective approaches. When implementation problems arose, she created better systems and provided additional training. When outcomes failed to improve as rapidly as expected, she sought expert consultation and refined her protocols. This acceptance of complete responsibility represents the core of command courage, the psychological willingness to stake one's reputation, career, and self-concept on the achievement of specific results. It requires abandoning the protective excuses that allow most people to maintain their self-esteem despite mediocre performance. It demands embracing a level of accountability that most individuals find terrifying because it makes failure personal rather than circumstantial. The teacher who transformed her school district demonstrated the same psychological courage when she decided to treat every student's failure as evidence of her own inadequacy rather than as confirmation of societal problems or family dysfunction. This was not masochistic self-blame but strategic ownership, the recognition that accepting complete responsibility, even for factors beyond her direct control, was the only way to access her full power to create change. This principle can be seen in the story of the emergency room physician who reduced patient waiting times from hours to minutes in one of the busiest urban hospitals in the country. When he became head of emergency services, the department was notorious for delays, overcrowding, and patient dissatisfaction. Previous administrators had blamed these problems on insufficient funding, inadequate staffing, and the unrealistic expectations of patients who used the emergency room for non-emergency care. The new department head refused to accept these explanations as final limitations. Instead, he treated the waiting time problem as a puzzle that could be solved through better analysis and system design. He spent weeks observing patient flow patterns, timing each step in the treatment process, and identifying bottlenecks that created delays. He discovered that most waiting occurred not because doctors were unavailable, but because of inefficiencies in triage, registration, testing, and communication between different departments. His solutions required coordination between multiple hospital departments and changes in long-established procedures. Laboratory tests needed to be prioritized differently. Radiology schedules had to be restructured. Nursing protocols required modification. Admission procedures needed streamlining. Each change required negotiation with other department heads who had their own priorities and constraints. Rather than demanding cooperation through hierarchical authority, he developed proposals that demonstrated how improved emergency department efficiency would benefit other departments as well. Faster patient processing would reduce overcrowding that affected the entire hospital. Better coordination would eliminate duplicate tests and procedures that wasted resources. Improved communication would reduce errors that created liability and additional work. More importantly, he was willing to guarantee the results of his proposed changes by linking his own performance evaluation to specific metrics. If waiting times did not decrease significantly within 6 months, he would accept responsibility for the failure and work with administration to develop alternative approaches. If patient satisfaction scores did not improve, he would acknowledge that his methods were inadequate and seek additional training or consultation. This guarantee of personal accountability transformed the negotiation dynamic with other department heads. They could see that he was not simply trying to shift blame for emergency department problems onto their departments, but was genuinely committed to creating solutions that worked for everyone. His willingness to stake his career on the success of his proposals created confidence that he would invest whatever effort was necessary to ensure their success. The results exceeded even his optimistic projections. Within 4 months, average waiting times had decreased from over 3 hours to under 30 minutes. Patient satisfaction scores improved dramatically. Staff morale increased as the work environment became less stressful and chaotic. The hospital's reputation improved, attracting patients who had previously avoided the emergency department because of its poor service. But the most significant transformation was cultural rather than operational. The success of the emergency department reforms demonstrated to the entire hospital that dramatic improvements were possible when someone was willing to accept complete responsibility for achieving them. Other departments began adopting similar approaches to their own challenges. The hospital's administration started expecting the same level of accountability and innovation from other department heads. This physician's success illustrates the final element of command courage, the willingness to use success as a platform for greater challenges rather than as an excuse for complacency. Having proven his ability to transform emergency department operations, he could have settled into a comfortable routine of maintaining his achievements. Instead, he began working on hospital-wide initiatives to improve patient outcomes and reduce costs. He accepted additional responsibilities that tested his leadership capabilities in new contexts. This progression from local to broader impact reflects Machiavelli's understanding that power unused is power lost. The individual who develops the capability for significant influence but chooses to exercise it only within narrow, safe boundaries will eventually find that capability atrophying. The habits of excellence, the willingness to accept responsibility, and the courage to make difficult decisions must be continuously exercised and expanded to remain vital. The businessman who built his empire demonstrated this principle throughout his career. Each success created opportunities for larger challenges, each solved problem revealed new problems that required solution, each level of achievement demanded new levels of competence and courage. He could never rest on his accomplishments because markets changed, competitors emerged, and customer expectations evolved. His power was sustained not by what he had achieved, but by his willingness to continuously adapt and grow. Similarly, the mother who raised 5 successful children found that her parenting responsibilities evolved but never ended. As her children became adults, her role shifted from direct guidance to supportive consultation, but her influence on their development continued. She had to learn new skills for relating to grown children, for advising without controlling, for supporting without enabling. Her power as a parent was sustained not by past achievements but by her continued relevance and wisdom in their lives. The consultant who built her reputation through systematic skill development found that success created new challenges that required continuous learning and adaptation. As her expertise became recognized, clients brought her increasingly complex problems that pushed the boundaries of her knowledge. She had to develop new capabilities, learn about new industries, and adapt her methods to different contexts. Her power was sustained not by repeating past successes but by continuously expanding her ability to create value for others. Each of these individuals discovered that the exercise of power is not a destination but a journey, a continuous process of growth, challenge, and adaptation that requires constant renewal of courage and commitment. They learned that avoiding power does not protect against its responsibilities but simply ensures that those responsibilities will be exercised unconsciously and ineffectively. They discovered that embracing power does not guarantee success but provides the only path toward meaningful achievement and lasting influence. The relentless power that most people avoid facing is not external force or political authority, but the fundamental human capacity for self-determination and influence. It is the power to choose our responses to circumstances, to shape our environment through our actions, to influence others through our example, and to create lasting value through our efforts. This power cannot be granted by others or taken away by external forces, it can only be claimed through conscious choice and sustained through disciplined practice. Machiavelli's great insight was not that power corrupts or that might makes right, but that power is inevitable and must therefore be exercised wisely. Every human being wields influence over their own life and the lives of others. The only choice is whether that influence will be exercised consciously and skillfully, or unconsciously and clumsily. Those who refuse to acknowledge their power do not become powerless, they become unconsciously powerful, wielding their influence in ways they neither recognize nor control. The path forward requires abandoning comfortable illusions about powerlessness and embracing uncomfortable truths about responsibility. It demands developing the competence to exercise influence effectively, the courage to bear the weight of consequences, and the wisdom to use power in service of worthy goals. It requires building systems and relationships that multiply our individual capabilities while serving the genuine interests of others.
Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the greatest tragedy is not the misuse of power, but its avoidance, the countless opportunities for positive impact that are lost when capable individuals choose safety over significance, comfort over contribution, and mediocrity over excellence. The relentless power we avoid facing is ultimately the power to matter, to make a difference, to leave the world somehow better than we found it. This power is not reserved for the few but available to all who are willing to claim it and bear its weight. In the end, Machiavelli's true lesson is not about the acquisition of dominance over others, but about the achievement of mastery over ourselves, the development of our full capabilities in service of purposes larger than our own comfort and security. This is the power that waits patiently for our acknowledgement, the force that can transform not only our own lives but the lives of all those whose paths cross ours. It is relentless because it never stops offering itself to us, never stops challenging us to become more than we currently are, never stops demanding that we step forward and claim our place as conscious agents in the great human enterprise of creation and progress. The question that remains is not whether we possess this power, we do. The question is whether we will have the courage to face it, the wisdom to develop it, and the character to use it well. The choice, as always, is ours.